My journey with this crested gecko, Delilah, began in 2017. Since then, she's grown a lot and lived in 2 different jungle-themed vivariums where she thrived. However, in pursuit of providing the best stewardship I can for my animals, and with iteration being long overdue, I felt it was time to make her something new. My goal this time is to capture the essence of the crested gecko's natural habitat to the best of my ability. Corlophus ciliatus is endemic to tropical forests on New Caledonia, a group of islands off the east coast of Australia. Once thought to be extinct, they were rediscovered in 1994 and have since become one of the most popular pet reptiles, and for good reason. They're adorable, long-lived, and easy to care for. Ironically, even with such popularity, typical vivarium designs, like the ones I've made before, don't accurately represent their natural habitat. A quick disclaimer before I continue. I don't see anything wrong with those setups, and what I'm about to do for Delilah is probably unnecessary. However, after working with countless species, I've concluded that providing as many naturalistic features as possible leads to a broader range of behaviors, making it easier to establish a connection. My hypothesis is that it makes humans appear like a harmless fixture in a larger environment, rather than something threatening, though I can't substantiate this with anything other than personal observation. With that in mind, I think 2 ideas hindered my previous crested gecko vivarium designs. They're arboreal and live in jungles. While both are true, I think perception is everything. When I think of arboreal, I tend to imagine life way up in the expanse of a treetop canopy. That is true for some animals, but crested geckos aren't one of them. From what I've gathered, they seem to inhabit the lower levels of undergrowth, roughly 3 to 12 feet above the ground, rather than in the canopy itself. They're not the most graceful animals around, so that's probably a good thing. That said, their proximity to the canopy isn't a failsafe for the feature of goofiness, but likely to avoid predation from other geckos who live further up, like the giant Leachianus. What's important is that the habitat a few feet above the ground is far different than the canopy, with the geckos seemingly spending most of their lives on smaller trees, skinny branches, and vines. That does occur in tropical forests, but you've probably gathered from the images and videos that they're fairly sparse, at least when compared to something like the Amazon rainforest, which tend to be the template for tropical vivariums. There's nothing wrong with that, it just doesn't represent their habitat, which was my goal for this build. I'll go into more detail later, but I knew in order to capture the essence of the sparse forest understory in a way that Delilah would remain comfortable, this had to be done in a large enclosure. To get exactly what I wanted, I decided to build that myself. A 90-gallon vivarium measuring 24 inches wide, 24 inches deep, and 36 inches tall. It's no secret that I usually cut most of my own glass. This wasn't one of those times. Instead, I ordered the paints from a local glazier to speed things up. Anyway, all of the pieces are 1/4 inch thick plate glass, except for the front, which is a 1/2 inch thick to accommodate the door tracks. Now what you're seeing here I filmed all the way back in January of 2025. Many details are lost in the process, and I didn't film this with a tutorial in mind. All that's to say, I'll do a dedicated video at a later time on how to build these, and try my best not to belabor the details here. If you've seen me build a tank before, this process was similar. However, with such a tall, top-heavy tank, assembly came with challenges. Adding a set of helping hands to hold the glass was invaluable. From there, the steps went as follows. Clean the glass to remove debris, install bumpers for consistent silicone between the glass, add anchoring tape, apply silicone to the edges, and bring the pieces together. I skipped masking the internal seams because they'd be hidden later. I also added frames like you'd see on a standard aquarium to distribute the enclosure's weight, allowing me to use fewer materials when building the stand. They'd also provide a recess to install a lid. I was able to secure the bottom pieces directly to the glass, while the top required additional glass strips to mount a track. My original plan with all of this was to drill the sides for cross ventilation, but I later modified it for a Euro-style front. The idea is to recess the substrate tray behind the door, which in practice creates a space for a vent. To add durability to the fiberglass screen that would cover this area, I secured it onto a custom cut PVC insert. Regular silicone doesn't stick well to plastic, but this stuff does. I have no clue what's different about it, but I've used it for similar applications in the past and it works well, so that's what I did here. However, I held off on adding the glass tracks until later. Vivariums fill with water and tend to function best with a drain. My preferred solution is to drill for a bulkhead so that the tank drains automatically. As for the lid, I simply made a window screen. This is an easy solution where you assemble a frame with corners, install the screen with the spline, then remove the excess. It's worth mentioning that fiberglass screen, as I used for the vent, tends to degrade from exposure to light and heat, so I prefer to use aluminum for my lids. And if done well, the little bumps on the corners cause it to fit tightly in a frame. Finally, I covered the sides with acrylic paint before moving it to the stand. I didn't plan to talk about the stand build in this video. However, it posed some unique challenges and seemed like a good talking point. I processed the lumber like usual by removing the factory edges and setting the stop block on the miter saw to cut the posts. Nearly every issue from there arose from the tank's height. I wanted another one to sit below 2 of these, which was easier said than done because of the ceiling height or lack thereof. Thankfully, I've become accustomed to building racks with notched posts and was able to save some space with them. I start by setting a guide for the initial cuts. Then I create a series of kerfs that get removed with the chisel. While it takes more time to do all of this, it saves on materials, is stronger, and strangely satisfying. Afterward, I used countersink and pocket holes to assemble it with hidden fasteners. That was all business as usual until I had a realization. I got most of the base structure built here and it's looking pretty good. I just have to add some support down here and it will pretty much be ready to go. The only thing is that I've been putting off this issue with the height pretty much since I've been working on it, and I got to get that sorted out now before I do any of the finishing work. And the thing is that I made it pretty tall out of necessity. It's about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch shorter than the ceilings in the animal room. That's not a problem except for the fact that moving it around and doing all this type of stuff, I can't do that in there because as soon as I tip it, it's going to start hitting the ceiling and it just wouldn't work. So I think what I'm going to do is cut this top right above where the tanks will go, turn that into its own canopy so that I can just take it off. It would eliminate enough height to where I could tip this and do everything I need to do. So I'm going to try to do that and see how it turns out. What I failed to mention is that I had to turn and tilt the rack to get it through the doors. Luckily, removing the top, cutting the posts, and modifying the canopy was simple. After doing all of that, I did the finishing work like grouting for side panels, sanding, and applying the finishes. A mandatory inclusion that I'm putting on all of my racks now are leveling feet. They make leveling a breeze and prevent water damage from inevitable spills. As expected, the stand fit well, but adding the canopy would be the moment of truth. It's gonna be a tight fit. It worked. I was very relieved by that because there was only a 1/2 inch to spare. In the previous vivariums, I made backgrounds for every side except the front. In an effort to maximize space and save time on what I anticipated would be the most time-consuming aspect of this project, I decided just to make one for the back. I'd use the same vertical concrete technique I've shown in builds like this one I did for my African bullfrog, another for a cane toad, the Ancient Ruins paludarium, and a milk snake. It's sturdy, holds detail well, and is relatively easy to work with, but I was about to add a layer of complexity by trying something new. Till now, I've nearly always used a piece of foam as a foundation for backgrounds. That works well, but I'm trying to minimize how much I use it. Casting concrete allowed me to build the Ancient Ruins without any, but that wouldn't work here, so I had to come up with an alternative. Banyan trees are a fixture in the Crested Gecko's habitat. Typically I'd make faux dirt for something like this, but I thought that having a tree as a backdrop made more sense, would be visually appealing, and provide a great challenge. While foam wouldn't be a part of the background itself, I did use it to build a rough shape of a tree. For this foamless technique to work, I had to build outside of the tank, which is easier anyway. That's when I made a form that matched its footprint. Many of you know I'm a little bit of a hoarder and like to save things I know I could use to build with, like this plastic wrap I got from a shipment. I used it to fill gaps and provide structure. the result being the rough shape of a banyan tree. Now this was my first try with this foamless technique, so it was a little overbuilt. I could do the same thing now with far less materials than what you're seeing here. Anyway, I used the rest of the shipping plastic to line the form, which would keep the concrete from sticking, though something like a plastic drop cloth could work well if you don't have something like this laying around. The vertical concrete I use works by combining it with a water-based cure promoter and primer and water. Once mixed, it has a light, airy consistency. With the way I was building this inside of a form, it made sense to start with a scratch coat. To do that, I covered every surface I wanted to become part of the tree with a thin layer of concrete roughly 1/2 inch thick. Shaping it was easy enough, and as it firmed up, I used a brush to help retain the form underneath. Right now it looks terrible, but that's to be expected. This is just the scratch coat. I'm going to use this as the foundation to build everything else off of. So now it's time to do the real work. I knew there was no hope of completing this in a single session, so I worked in steps. First I brushed on primer to ensure the next layer would stick. Then I applied the crete as before. What I enjoy about this material is that I'm able to create things I couldn't with the methods I used to use, but there is a caveat. Had I made this a few years ago with those older techniques, it likely only would have taken a day or two, whereas this took 2 weeks to complete. While I think it's worth the added time and effort, it adds to how long it takes for me to make these videos, so any support you'd want to give this one would mean the world. Achieving the form of something like a tree is easiest while the concrete is smooth. Carving details, on the other hand, is more effective as it firms up. With various carving tools at my disposal, I carved out from the knot hole. Carefully making as many details as I could gave me the look I wanted, but it took time. So much so that I had to periodically spray the surface to slow the curing process. As you're viewing this unfold, you may be thinking the same thing I was. It looks like I'm doing something, but I don't actually see much. Standing the background up to get a new perspective changed everything. It also greatly improved my ability to make the bark's texture. The scratch coat helped too. Scraping down select locations to this base layer created a nice chipped bark effect. Unfortunately, spraying and covering it with wet rags between sessions only worked for so long. Eventually I had to repeat the steps from before to complete the remainder. Afterward, I brushed it down with a wire brush to complete the texture. That meant I could finally see how effective my foam-free technique was. I didn't know what to expect from the demolding process, but it went quite well. I was able to easily remove everything, which left me with plenty of foam for future projects and a background free of it. Alternatively, I could have used something like a lathe or mesh to create an armature, which would have used less concrete and saved weight. I thought that would have been a little excessive for something of this scale though. Before I could bring it to life with color, I cleaned the edges. The top was flat, so it just needed a quick sanding, while the sides were slightly skewed, requiring significant alterations with an angle grinder. It took a few tries to get it right, and at 40 pounds it wasn't too difficult to move around, but I had to be extremely careful around the edges of the tank. I think it looks pretty good. After making those adjustments, it fits pretty much perfect in the tank. It's not the easiest thing to get in there, but it's pretty much to be expected with this sort of thing. I still have to color it and add some more details to it, but I didn't want to do any of that until I knew for sure that it fit in here. So now it's time for the fun, I guess. These water-based concrete glazes always take things to the next level. I painted brown onto chipped bark sections, or areas where water would collect, to simulate weathering. Once dry, I sprayed black, wet it down, and wiped it away to accentuate cracks and fine details. However, that made everything look too dark, so I used a scouring pad to bring highlights to the raised surfaces. Then I added an olive tint to provide character and continuity. Doing so removed the highlights again. I brought them back one last time with a wire brush drill attachment. Unlike everything you just saw, installation could not have been more simple. I just applied silicone to where it contacts the glass and carefully hoisted it up into the tank. While that cured, I used a piece of foam to wedge it in place. This is also when I decided to install the bulkhead drain. In order for things to continue taking shape, it needs hardscape. I'm going to do things very differently this time though, because I need branches with some serious character, and everything I need is right here in my backyard. As mentioned, the habitat I'm trying to recreate consists largely of skinny trees. Finding those was basically effortless. That's because a crazy microburst tore through my street last year, knocking down several trees, including this shagbark hickory. The pieces I wanted to extract from it were dry and free of decay, and hickory is a vivarium safe hardwood. Plus, it features peeling bark, which is likely something the geckos use in their natural range. This tree alone easily could have provided everything I needed. I cut a few branches off of it, and even pulled this larger limb. However, for variety's sake, I decided to collect some from others as well. Needless to say, I ended up with much more than I needed. While sifting through these piles, I selected pieces that I felt were best for creating a usable habitat for Delilah. Take this piece for example. I knew the horizontal area would be a perfect perch. They just had to be cut to fit. Of course, I did my best with that outside, but a few indoor adjustments were inevitable. With such an amazing selection to choose from, creating something interesting was effortless, and seeing everything in the tank gave me a little bit of a wacky idea. I knew that large section from before would be perfect for the peeled bark effect. However, I didn't want it to occupy the entire tank. My solution was simple: cut it in half. I figured this would save space while creating unique, usable features on the glass. I knew this was the right move because immediately I saw how much promise it had, but it was too tall and needed a trim. After experimenting with a few layouts, I determined it looked best with them together on the right side. Using these as a key element of sorts, I configured the remaining branches in a way that I thought Delilah would like. I'll discuss more about that shortly. However, I couldn't leave the branches in the tank as is because I still hadn't done anything to sanitize them. I suppose there could be a risk of pathogens and whatnot, but truthfully, my main concern is pests, like mites or powder post beetles, which I recently had a run-in with as I was making the milk snake vivarium. I don't particularly like the idea of putting driftwood in the oven, and these are a little too large to boil on the stove like I typically would, so I plan to put them on my grill. Naturally, they didn't fit on there either, and as I considered my options, this is what I came up with. It's a giant outdoor stock pot large enough to boil some serious hardscape. I was very reluctant to buy it at first, but I wanted to use these materials, and quite honestly, I'm tired of always being at the mercy of some business to get the materials I need to make these designs. After all, hardscape is easily one of the most expensive components to nature design. If you're only making a tank or two, it's probably not worth it, but if this is something you do often, it may be a solution worth looking into. These particular branches were too large for a single session, so I had to work in steps. I boiled it for 2 hours. Then I shut it off, let it cool, flipped everything around, and boiled it for 2 more hours. All in, they spent roughly 5 to 6 hours in water, though at a rolling boil, 1 to 2 hours should be more than sufficient for most pieces. In order to create that peeling bark effect later on, I chiseled some off before putting them in the tank. The flats looked as good as before, only this time, I'd install them. Silicone was more than enough since they had contact with the glass, while others required support on the bottom to lift them up toward the screen. Then I secured the ones that touched it from the outside with stainless steel screws. For the smaller branches, this worked exceptionally well. Even though I was trying to avoid it, I decided to foam the bottoms of the branches for stability. Once cured, I carved away excess to leave room for substrate. This was a great start, but trees weren't going to be enough. Crested geckos encounter and utilize vines in their habitats, so I wanted to include some. However, the ones I ordered arrived bundled and stiff. I figured I might as well try putting them in the stock pot to see if that would make them flexible again. I added some hickory bark while I was at it. Boiling everything worked as expected. Now the vines were easy to unwrap and weave through the branches. I found that a ratchet cutter was a great way to remove excess. The vast majority were stable enough between the branches, not really requiring any support. Even so, I did have to screw a few to the screen, while these smaller ones needed aquarium epoxy. After it cured, I hit it with super glue and crushed aqua soil. This is also when I secured the bark, which more or less completed the scape. This arrangement is meant to resemble the forest undergrowth where crested geckos originate, consisting of smaller branches and vines. In doing so, I felt that providing a lot of surface area for Delilah to climb on was essential. The temperature, UV exposure, and humidity will vary throughout the enclosure, and with so many perches throughout those ranges, at any given time she can easily access her preferred microclimate. I also used the features of the hardscape to create several tight hiding places where she can retreat for security if desired. I wasn't ready for them just yet, but I knew that adding plants would help too. In the meantime, I installed the glass tracks with waterproof mounting tape and a mister nozzle in the lid. I also took the time to spray everything down to remove debris. Here you can get a closer look of the drain in action, which appeared to be in good working order. I've experimented with various false bottom materials over the years, yet I always return to Leica. Its water retention capabilities are invaluable. However, given the surface area it provides for beneficial bacteria and springtail colonies, I believe it likely promotes a more robust bioactive process than other methods. After allowing them to soak, I covered the drain with a screen and filled the bottom. In light of everything I just said, with an auto drain, this layer doesn't need to be very deep. No matter how hard you try, debris will inevitably end up in this layer, but minimizing it as much as possible is best. My solution here was twofold. First, I put down a carbon filter mat as the main barrier. That wasn't straightforward because I had to cut around the branches and piece it together. However, gaps around the sides and branches is where debris would sneak through. Pressing sphagnum moss into them would help significantly, though expanding foam would have been more thorough. All of this set the foundation for plants, beginning with a beautiful New Caledonian species, the false Aurelia. That said, it's likely not actually in the gecko's range. Nevertheless, it worked well in past designs and seemed like a good option for this one as well. I just had to remove the substrate, separate the stems, and thoroughly rinse the entire plant. Weaving them through the hardscape wasn't that easy, but it had to be done. I knew this was the best way to create the appearance of a small tree growing through everything in the undergrowth, while providing visual barriers, and thus a sense of security for Delilah on said features. And I gotta say that planting them before adding the substrate worked really well. The blend I used is something similar to what I did in the past, which is a substrate that will remain fluffy under wet conditions. A benefit to such a tall enclosure is that I didn't have to skimp on substrate like I had in the past. I was able to add a substantial amount without making a noticeable dent in the tank's usable footprint. A native plant that does actually fall in the gecko's range is the bird's nest fern. I added a few to the bottom for visual appeal. Ficus benjamina, on the other hand, isn't. I thought it would work well and look good in this setup though. The soil where the geckos live is often full of limestone coral. I wanted to include something similar here, so I smashed up calcium carbonate aquarium rock to mix within the substrate. The only other major components that were missing at this point were botanicals and leaf litter. The best place to go for those was back outside. Most of what I collected were oak twigs and leaves, but I also pulled a few miscellaneous botanicals from my stash. This was a great opportunity to batch process botanicals I needed to replenish in other setups too. While everything was cooking down, I added the first inhabitants, springtails. In no time their population will grow and become an integral part of the cycle within this tank. I proceeded to cover them and the landscape with a blanket of botanicals. I also mixed in some extra pieces of hickory bark while I was at it. These will provide excellent habitat for the springtails and the isopods. They're great to have around in these gecko tanks. They'll eat any excess food, turning them into usable nutrients for the plants. To this point in the build, I'd simply been using an LED shop light for visibility. I switched that out for an LED grow light and a 6% UVB. However, crested geckos are classified in Ferguson Zone 1, requiring minimal UV exposure. The 6% was too strong in higher locations, so I covered it with an aluminum sheet to diffuse the light until I get a different bulb. That meant it was finally ready for the doors, which looked great. By that I mean hardly visible. Of course, I can't help what Delilah will do to them on the inside, but adding bumper catches on the outside will at least help on my end of things. The final addition was this adjustable fan. I have it set on a timer so that it runs automatically a few times a day. Because of how infrequently it runs, it has minimal impact on humidity while ensuring the air doesn't become stagnant. Other than a few minor tweaks with things like the lighting, it's finally ready to go, and I'm so excited to introduce Delilah to her new vivarium. I wonder what she'll think. Watching her gently crawl onto this vine and rest was a joy. The best way I can describe it is that it just looked right. Of course, a new forest meant unfamiliar smells. Her little tongue flicked non-stop as she gathered information about the surroundings. She eventually mustered up enough courage to explore. Unsurprisingly, that meant retreating behind the plant, where she clung to the background until settling on a vine behind the branches. Crested geckos are largely nocturnal, so that was about what I had expected to happen. I knew she'd likely stay put until the lights went out. I returned a little later to find her perched up on a vine. I didn't plan for it, but this project ended up being perfect for the 2 million subscriber milestone, which happened a few days before this upload. You see, the channel has always been about using the resources I have at any given time to create the best possible habitats for my animals, while sharing them with all of you. The iterative approach is one of my favorite parts because there's always something new to learn and improve upon. This video really is night and day from what I first did with crested geckos on the channel a decade ago with Henry. He was meant to be a part of this as well, but sadly, he's no longer with us. At the very least, he's the reason I love crested geckos, and ultimately the inspiration behind this project. It's never lost on me how blessed I am to have had a hobby turn into a career. I know it's kind of become routine in these videos, but I truly mean it when I say I'm thankful for your support over these years. While time consuming, building this was actually the easy part. Finding resources about New Caledonian geckos in the wild, now that's a little bit of a different story. Their habitats are just poorly documented, at least in a way that's easily accessible. All of that was a great reminder to me of how special the opportunity to work with these amazing animals truly is. I'd love to one day document their habitat for myself, but I don't know if I ever will, so I'd be remiss not to show appreciation to those who already have. Exoterra's The Crested Gecko Expedition and Dave Kaufman's The New Caledonia Gecko movie were quite helpful, and the recent research in Crested Geckos of New Caledonia, the documentary, from Thomas Marriott at Exotics Keeper was invaluable. He also appeared on the Animals at Home podcast, where I got the idea for peeling bark. Funny enough, one of those released as I was escaping Delilah's tank, which was the perfect listen. I should say that I don't have any affiliation with these, but I'll leave links in the video description if you want to learn more. The goal of this project was ultimately to house my crested geckos in a more naturalistic setting than before. I've been working on this off and on for over a year, so finally seeing Delilah in her new home feels amazing. I'm also thankful to have been able to share the journey with all of you. If you like this project, you'll also enjoy the time I struggled through a vivarium build for a milk snake, or when I made a mansion for an abandoned bearded dragon. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.